With the South Korea-U.S. summit now just about 10 days away, the top diplomats and negotiators of the two countries are keeping themselves busy with a series of pre-summit talks. President Moon Jae-in today showed a strong determination to keep the flame of nuclear dialogue alive, saying neither the two Koreas nor the U.S. wish to go back to the past. Will the three sides be able to find an exit from the nuclear deadlock this time? For an in-depth discussion on this issue, Dr. James Kim of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies now joins us in the studio. Thank you for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Dallin.
So many pre-summit talks are well underway following the foreign ministers' meeting last week. Top nuclear envoys of Seoul and Washington are meeting this week as well. And defense ministers of South Korea and the U.S. will also hold talks early Tuesday morning. How do you see this busy movements of high-ranking officials, and what do you think would be their top agenda?
I think President Moon has made it clear that he wants to play the facilitator's role here to get the talks back on track. Clearly the ball's on the North Korean side of the court, but I think he wants to get some concessions out of the U.S. to move a bit closer towards North Korea so that Pyongyang could come out of its shell. So North Korea is definitely on top of the agenda, but there are other issues that are outstanding bilaterally if you look at the U.S.-South Korean relations. Extension of the exemption on the Iran sanctions is one. The other is the special measures agreement, the burden sharing agreement that South Korea had struck with the United States, earlier this year. It's only in effect for 1 year, so they have to go back to the negotiation table again to try to get a new agreement for next year or possibly even further. And then there's another issue that hasn't been really talked about, Section 232 report on the auto tariff, which the Commerce Department has already presented to the President. The President has about 90 days to respond on this issue, and if he doesn't, then this issue goes away, and the Commerce Department has to do another finding again. But if he does issue an auto tariff, it will impact South Korean exports to the United States.
So North Korea will definitely be on the top agenda, but they do have quite several other important issues to iron out. Now, getting down to specific details, following the South Korea-U.S. foreign ministers meeting last week, we've learned that the two sides have reached a comprehensive agreement, and they found the common ground on the need to resume North Korea-U.S. talks. What exactly do they mean by a comprehensive agreement?
Yeah, so this isn't exactly clear because some of this is coming through from the Korean media and it's not coming through the Foreign Press Corps. So it's not clear to me where this information is coming from. There are two possibilities. One, from what Minister Kang had already said publicly to both the Korean media and the foreign press media, that the U.S. and South Korea has a common understanding about the end objectives of these nuclear talks, that they both want to get denuclearization from North Korea. That's one possibility. The other possibility is this issue, this idea of comprehensive agreement with stage-phased approach on the implementation side for any deal that is struck with North Korea. And it's not clear to me what this means because there's some interpretation going on in the Korean media that suggests the latter interpretation of what Minister Kang was alluding to. But I think this is really splitting hairs because there isn't any formal announcement from either side on this. And so I'm going to go with Minister Kang's earlier statement that there's an agreement between the United States and South Korea about the end objectives of these talks. In terms of how they move forward on that, there's some gap there that needs to be worked out.
Now, U.S. President Trump reportedly was open to easing North Korea's sanctions, given that there is a snapback clause. Snapback clause, simply put, meaning sanctions would be lifted, but also immediately reimposed if North Korea violates any of the agreement. Now, while much attention is on what kind of card South Korea would lay out on the table this time to break this nuclear impasse, do you think this snapback clause could be a useful card for South Korea too? So
this was first raised by a high-ranking official from North Korea, that this was something that was raised by President Trump during the Hanoi meeting. And it's not at all surprising to me that they were considering this as a potential option. But as it was revealed by high-ranking officials in the United States after the Hanoi summit, these sanctions regimes are layered. on top of one of each other. So if you take one aspect of it out, essentially, the whole sanctions regime is gone. And then the second issue about the snapback side, on the implementation side, it's really tough to get the sanctions back online without a prior agreement to this effect. So snapback, while the idea is an interesting one, from a policy standpoint, it's not clear to me exactly how that would be worked out. So there's still a lot of work there that needs to be done if the two sides are going to agree to this. So while the idea is noble, to me, it's a little bit unclear exactly how you're going to get there.
It's a good idea, but it sounds a bit unrealistic. Now, staying with sanctions, Trump made another surprising remark on North Korea, saying that North Korea is now suffering greatly and that additional sanctions are unnecessary at this point. How do you interpret this?
So this is fairly consistent position that the U.S. has held out before and also after the Hanoi summit, and even more so after the Hanoi summit, given that Kim Jong-un's only demand during that meeting was sanctions relief. So from President Trump's point of view, sanctions are working. If not, the expectations that are tied to the sanctions are working, and the North Koreans are racing against the time to get a deal that where they could get some relief on these sanctions. So this was something that was raised in the last round when the Treasury designated two entities from China on the shipping side, and President Trump tweeted that he doesn't want additional measures there. And then there were some disagreements about exactly what he was alluding to, whether it was the original Treasury announcement or something else that the U.S. was getting ready for. But overall, I think the president's position on this is that the ball is on the side of Pyongyang's court, and Pyongyang needs to make the next move. And he's not going to make it difficult for Kim Jong-un, that he's going to try to give him the benefit of the doubt so that he comes out to these talks.
Now, the mysterious chemistry between North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and U.S. President Trump is not fading away, with Mr. Trump once again stating that he and Kim Jong-un, they understand each other. But other top officials in Washington appear firm on the need to continue maximum pressure. How do you assess the current somewhat confusing Washington's North Korea policy? So
President Trump has made these kinds of statements in the past where he's alluded to Kim Jong-un as something even more extreme, right? They're in love with one another, that they're great friends. And again, he's not being inconsistent there in the position that he's taken since earlier part of last year when he agreed to the Singapore summit. After Singapore, he's maintained this position. He hasn't really spoken about Kim Jong-un in a very negative way. And it's his position that he wants to keep the channels open for dialogue. But you're right, there seems to be some gap here, if not a disconnect between the administration officials and the president on this issue. And I'm alluding to precisely that issue having to do with the two designations that Treasury made about a couple of weeks ago, these Chinese entities, that there's a view in Washington that they need to lay on even more pressure to get Pyongyang to move away from its original position to come closer towards the United States. But again, the president wants to give Kim Jong-un the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't want to make it difficult for him. He wants to give him a chance to respond. And so I think that the president wants to stay in the waiting mode, but there's a general agreement here between the administration officials and the president that they want to keep at this dialogue and the diplomacy channel. And they want to see where this goes, that they're not going back to 2017 of fire and fury.
According to Reuters, President Trump handed over a document to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un at the Hanoi summit, the document which bluntly calls for a transfer of North Korean nuclear weapons and fissile materials to the U.S. Now, some point out that this might have been a major factor that led to the collapse of the Hanoi summit. What's your take on this report?
Well, the president made clear right after the summit in the press conference that he wanted complete denuclearization and that Kim Jong-un would declare everything and put it on the table so that he can give him the sanctions relief that he wanted. So it is not at all surprising to me that he made this kind of a gesture, if you will, or an offer And whether that led to the break, yeah, well, it did, because North Korea didn't want to do that. And that was fairly clear from the press conference as well. So this is not at all surprising to me. But exactly what he had in there in terms of what he meant by all the fissile materials, because that in itself is a process, identifying the sites and then being able to secure that site and then be able to remove it and then verify whether that actually happened. It's not something that you can do overnight. There are probably multiple sites here we're talking about, some of them that the U.S. knows about and some of which the U.S. might not know about. And then the verification process in and of itself, I think, is going to be a long, arduous march. So while the idea is interesting, and sure, this would have been something that would have been a no-starter for North Korea, as we saw in Hanoi, maybe North Korea needs to rethink the U.S. position on this. And the U.S. also is, I think, reassessing North Korea's views about denuclearization as well.
North Korea broke its long silence on the intrusion at the North Korean embassy in Spain. During an interview with a local news outlet, North Korea's foreign ministry spokesperson called the intrusion a grave terrorist attack and said that North Korea is keeping a close eye on the intrusion. But to me, this sounded a bit toned down given the harsh rhetoric North Korea usually lashes out at the U.S. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's been very measured, even after the Hanoi summit. And we haven't heard anything that's really incendiary coming out from the KCNA or the Rodong Shinmun, right? We saw some incendiary remarks coming from Choi Sun-hee, who's, again, the high-ranking official that I was alluding to earlier. But that's par for the course with Choi Sun-hee. In terms of other officials and Kim Jong-un himself, we haven't heard anything that is really incendiary. And it seems like North Korea is also trying to play this safe and keep that possibility of the talks open for now. Because I don't think they've really made their decision yet whether to come back to the talks or go back to provocations. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. Again, the U.S. seems to have a fairly open mind on this issue, but they're, again, very, very strong on their position that, that there's not going to be any sanctions relief without complete denuclearization.
So you think Kim Jong-un is not yet quite ready? He's still mulling his next step. Now, a heavy burden is on President Moon Jae-in's shoulders, who from the beginning asserted that South Korea should play a big role as a mediator. Now, how do you assess the Moon administration's role as a mediator so far, and what kind of strategy do you think South Korea should take to break this nuclear impasse?
So President Moon has stepped in at various points in time over the past year, or a little over a year or so, to get the talks back on track whenever it kind of derailed. And we saw that happen with Choi Sun-hee's remark right after the March announcement about the Singapore summit last year. There were some very incendiary remarks about the U.S. Bargaining position. And then President Trump sends a letter to Congress saying that he's not, well, sends a letter to North Korea and presents it to Congress that he's not going to be going to the Singapore talks. President Moon steps in with the summit between North and South Korea at the DMZ, and all of a sudden talks are back on track. Singapore happens. We saw President Moon essentially offering to President Trump before the Hanoi summit that South Korea is there to chip in wherever it's necessary to allow for some kind of incentive for North Korea. Hasn't really made an impact on the Hanoi summit. He's now trying to go again on this by meeting with President Trump and talking about some potential, some incentive packages that both South Korea and the U.S. might be able to offer North Korea, or try to get some mutual understanding on exactly how to proceed. Whether this is going to work or it's not going to work, it's not clear to me yet, but the U.S. position since last year hasn't changed on this issue of denuclearization. And it's not clear to me why this visit is going to lead to that. So again, it'll be interesting to watch whether President Moon can convince President Trump to change his position on this, but it's not going to be, it's going to be a very difficult task for him. So again, the ball's going to be back on, the ball is on the North Korean side, but President Moon now has some he's trying to see if there's some things that he can do to get the North Koreans back out, to get some concessions from the U.S., or after this meeting, he's going to have to go back and try to initiate talks with North Korea and see if Kim Jong-un is willing to make any concessions on his part. But it's a really, really difficult balancing act for President Moon.
Well, it sure won't be easy, but I truly hope that some progress will be made this time in Washington. Thank you for your perspectives today, Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Don.